Good evening and welcome to Law Talk, the show that brings the law, the news, and the Constitution to you each month. Mark, what are we doing tonight?
Well, Jim, first we're going to talk about the Benghazi attack. There was a hearing and the Secretary of State, or ex-Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, gave testimony, and there was some pretty interesting developments.
Oh, from what I remember of this is actually she gave testimony on, I think, her last official day, or it was the second to last day of her position as Secretary of State. It seems like a little late to give a speech or testimony on Benghazi if you're about to walk away. So how did that turn out?
Well, you're right. It was the last testimony that she would be able to be forced to give. It wasn't really, you know.
Wasn't it under oath?
I'm not sure that, but it really didn't seem like, you know, she had to answer questions like yes or no. It seemed like people couldn't be objective. She was evasive. So it seemed to me like it was kind of informal.
Well, wait a minute.
Maybe that's just the way it was handled.
Well, I understand this was put on in a very formal setting. They've been requesting her presence in front of this Senate committee for almost 60 days.
Right.
And she had gone through a series of events that delayed her presence at the hearing.
Well, there were tragedies. She was injured. Yeah, she was injured. She had a fall and had a concussion or maybe a stroke and cold and the flu. And,
oh, really?
And, you know, so
did we just open the medical Bible and determine what illnesses we can have so we don't testify in front of Congress? Was that the idea?
So anyway, what was an interesting quote, I mean, I guess she got in a tiff with one of the senators, and she said, well, she said, well, 4 Americans are dead, which is, you know, a big tragedy, and there's a lot of theories about why that happened. But she said, well, was it because of a protest, or was it because of guys out for a walk who decided they'd go kill some Americans?
Oh, wait a minute. As I remember correctly, we've gone through a whole litany of different stories about what happened. One, it was just a spontaneous uprising, and they were following the Egyptian overrun of the American consulate.
Protests, yeah.
But unfortunately, this was on 9/11, so that idea about a spontaneous, on 9/11, that calls into question. But then the second one was there was a video, and I understand that video was a pretty cheesy video showing some kind of people acting as Muslims, and somehow that offended them around the world when the video was played nowhere except on one YouTube clip. But then it turned into, it's an armed insurrection and attack of the consulate. So what story did Hillary Clinton give us?
Well, some people say, you know, she was being facetious about this. This was a joke. She was just kidding around. Kind of taking the whole thing lightly, that, you know, she's really not saying that some guys were just out for a walk with their rocket launchers and AK-47s and do a coordinated attack on a consulate. But, you know, it's hard to say. The first theory about the video seems a little bit bizarre. The theory that it's a spontaneous protest that turns into a rocket launching attack on a, you know, well-armed, fortified
allegedly well-armed and fortified.
Well, I mean,
it was a consulate that had the wall blown out by, dynamite had blown the wall out about a month earlier. So we already had a wall that you could march in an army that was never fixed because the Secretary of State, or it never got up that you had to fix the wall at a secure. And by the way, this is the country, Libya, that just went through a complete civil war where the leader was executed, where who runs the opposition is a terrorist state, and the president has very little power, and he sits in his one little city, but the rest of the country is controlled by Al Qaeda and a variety of other terrorist groups.
Well, also I think that the local militias were supposed to provide protection.
Well, local militias are the same people that were involved with the attack, and the local militia, even if they were to provide protection, obviously they were out at a different location, maybe sunning themselves on the beach, but they missed this. But the problem.
So basically, we have 3 theories. The first theory was that it was a protest, 9/11 protest,
right?
And then that got a little out of hand and it turned into an attack. Second theory was a video that enraged people, so they did an attack. And the third theory, whether we don't know whether to take this seriously or not, even though maybe it was under oath, maybe it was a formal session, maybe it's just a joke. I mean, maybe Hillary's thinking of the whole kind of thing as a joke, and she's saying it's because protest, or because some guys out for a walk who decided they'd go kill some Americans. So maybe it was just a joke.
I think that was being facetious.
Yeah.
I don't think she was being serious about that. But the problem is that the head of the CIA gave testimony where he said that we had visual on this within the hour from the start of the protest. They had full knowledge that this was totally coordinated with movements of terrorist groups coming in from different angles, using different weapons, including suppressive fire with mortars. Not quite, I'm out walking the dog with my AK-47. So that whole little snippet that I'm making a joke or being sarcastic about why do we care routine. I do remember I watched that testimony. I was shocked when I saw the Secretary of State make comments as though the lives of 4 Americans mean nothing to her just because it happened a little while ago. It's fairly shocking. And I'm sincerely hoping that John Kerry takes his position a little more seriously.
Well, a lot of people would disagree with you on that. But what's interesting about some of the things that came out, okay, on 9/11 in 2012 at 5 p.m., the Joint Chief of Staff, Chairman General Martin Dempsey, and Defense Secretary Leon Panetta had a pre-scheduled meeting with the President at 5 p.m. that day. They gave him a 20-minute briefing on the Benghazi attack. And then the president said, "Well, it's up to you guys. I mean, in other words, it's up to the defense secretary. It's up to the Joint Chief of Staff." So he said, "You guys do whatever you do. It's up to you." And the president had no more input into this situation after that, apparently.
Yeah. Well,
also, the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, apparently didn't have any contact on this thing at all. So it was up to those folks. Then there was 8 hours.
Wait a minute, are you talking about the aides to the Secretary of State? It was up to them to make a decision?
Well, apparently the Joint Chief of Staff, General Martin Dempsey and Leon Panetta were in this meeting. And they say their story is that the president says it's up to us, right? And then the president was out of it. And then for the next 8 hours, there was no military assets deployed to help or any action at all.
Well, do you realize
except maybe for some surveillance?
As you should know, there's been testimony of generals that are in the region that actually stated very clearly there was assets less than an hour and a half away. They were never called. It was also true that they were visually watching it live. It was also true that they actually had unmanned drones they could have flown in from Jordan. So there's a whole lot of stories here about what could have happened, may have happened, would have happened. But that's not the point.
But if I remember correctly, Hillary said that they weren't watching it. They didn't see it live.
Yeah, but see, unfortunately, they have video of people watching it from the moment less than a moment after it started. And the problem here is that it was 9/11. Come on. I mean, 9/11 is kind of a sacrosanct day in our history, especially as it deals with terrorists.
And another thing that came out, that Panetta and Dempsey knew at that 5 p.m. meeting was a terrorist attack. They didn't think it was a video. They didn't think it was out people for a walk. That was something that was kind of apparently manufactured later.
Well, wait a minute. I have a question then. Then why was Susan Rice, the Secretary of the UN, sent out on the Sunday shows 5 days later and said the story, it was all a video, no big deal, we got the guy with the video?
Because Hillary Clinton doesn't like Sunday talk shows.
Hillary Clinton should have been on those Sunday talk shows.
No, she doesn't like doing that Sunday circuit.
Yeah, so wait a minute. But wait a minute. Her not liking the Sunday talk shows, this is a Secretary of State issue. And I know Hillary wants to run for president, and she's a great statesman, and I don't have any questions about that. The problem is, on this subject, there was many flaws in her decision-making. Was she even notified that this was going on to her ambassador, who works directly under her in Benghazi? Was she even notified? No. Was the president even aware of what's going on? Maybe. Because the next day he said, oh, terrorists, and when he was in the Rose Garden. But the problem I'm seeing here is a categoric misrepresentation to the people over what actually happened. Now, for whatever reason, that there seems to be so many stories about what happened, it's more important that we look to the future, to other embassies, so we don't run into the same problem in the future just because there's nobody at the helm when something serious happens. And that's what I see. I see a complete disarray of those in the chain of command. And it should have been left up to the military, but the military had no orders to do anything.
Well, I think that, in defense of Secretary Hillary, she might say that even though, let's say, the defense secretary knew and the Joint Chief of Staff knew it was a terrorist attack, maybe she didn't. Yeah, she wasn't in that meeting.
I'm not questioning the fact maybe she wasn't called. Maybe she wasn't available. Maybe she didn't get that phone call. Whatever reason.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, this is a good learning lesson as we go forward so that other embassies, given the hot topic of the terrorists right now, I think it's just a go forward look, and I think on that end we should just move on. What's our next subject tonight, Mark?
Next thing we have are some recess appointments for the National Labor Relations Board and the Consumer Protection Bureau. I think Consumer and Finance, CFPB.
Well, that's a new. The Consumer Protection Bureau is a new.
But I mean, it's a
new department. That
I think it's a Finance Protection Bureau or something like that.
Yeah, it's
basically
it's a new regulatory overview of the consumer generally, which kind of goes all over the market.
Well, I think what it does is, like, say for instance, you don't pay your credit cards, they raise your rates. They don't want to do that. They want to raise everyone's rates to cover the people who aren't paying. So it's kind of a, leveling the field on everyone.
Leveling the playing field.
Leveling the playing field.
We're talking about leveling the playing field.
It's a fairness issue.
So is that a redistribution issue?
It's a fairness issue.
Okay, fairness issue.
It's a fairness issue. So that's those, and then the National Labor Relations Board, I don't know if we really call it a fairness issue, but it's pretty pro-labor, 3 folks on that board that were appointed.
Well, I understand that there was 3 appointments, and each of them have direct ties to unions, all either union managers, union organizers, and these were all appointed I understand, while the Senate was allegedly in recess. But what did the court find, Mark?
Well, the D.C. Court, District of Columbia Court of Appeals, struck down the appointments in Noel Canning versus NLRB. And now, what the Justice Department had said was that the President of the United States could decide if the Senate was in session. The executive branch could say, "Hey, is the Senate genuinely, capable of exercising constitutional function?" And the President in this case said, "Well, this is a pro forma gathering of the Senate, and they're not capable of exercising their constitutional function here, so they're in recess." That was the executive.
Time out here. You're telling me that although the pro forma was created under the George Bush presidency by Harry Reid, that the pro forma was being utilized by the Republicans during a non-recess, and then somehow the president tried to appoint people and circumvent the Senate? Is that what we're talking about here, Mark?
Yeah, Senator Reid, the majority leader, when Bush was in power, in 2007, developed this pro forma session response as a means of slowing down appointments or stopping appointments
from
happening.
Does this mean that Senate's supposed to still be in session then?
Right.
So it's officially in session.
So instead of having every senator there, most of the senators there, maybe they don't have a quorum, but they might have 4 senators giving a speech or something like that. So it's pro forma. But there are people there. And, the president at that time, the Republican, George Bush, he did not...
he didn't try to appoint people.
He didn't try to do
around the Congress.
Well, he declined to unilaterally select officials, right? Okay. That's what the most recent president has unilaterally selected officials without going through Congress.
Wait a minute, whoa. This is a constitutional issue. This isn't about just I want to make an executive order that I can do whatever I want.
That's why we call it constitutional.
Because there's a balance of there's something that we have. It's called the balance of power.
Right.
Congressional, executive. I mean, come on here. So you're trying to tell me that the president unfortunately decided that on his own opinion, that the Senate wasn't in power. I mean, wasn't in session. It wasn't in session. So I'm going to appoint 3 pro-union people to the NLRB, which is in charge of controlling all labor board issues in the country. Is that what you're telling me?
Right. Well,
okay.
Well, when you look at the NLRB, it's a pretty powerful position.
Completely.
I think there's a couple seats missing. Right.
Well, you have to have a majority. It's three. You have to have at least.
But I
3.
think they can have 5 or.
Yeah, they're supposed to have 5, but they only had 3, and those were the 3 appointees that we're talking about here.
So almost all the hundreds of decisions that have made have been pro-labor, or you could say that if you're a business person, it would be to the detriment of business.
Oh, you're talking about the Boeing, when Boeing was told they couldn't leave Washington State because they're moving to a right-to-work state that does not have unions.
Well, there's that amongst that, but there was also things to do with voting and notice and how long a company has to prepare for a union vote.
Oh, you're talking about the open vote.
Open
union vote, whether you want to choose to change a shop into a union shop, and instead of the secret vote, the secret ballot, which has been in history, no, we're going to open it up so now you're intimidated if you show your vote to the next person. That's a union man.
Okay, there was also some issues about how long you have to give notice before you hold the vote. And so in other words, you have lesser time. You used to have a longer time. They shortened that so the business doesn't have very long
to
lobby.
prepare an opposition.
To lobby, yeah.
And lobby the people.
Right.
But you know what? This is interesting
a lot of
because
cases,
I
yeah.
understand in that case that the 3 judges voted unanimously.
You're talking about the D.C. court, yeah.
Yeah, the D.C. court, to say that they're voiding the decisions made by the NLRB, specifically in the Channing case, but that they reach across the board, and it's all the decisions that have been made by this, because all 3 representatives that were appointed in an alleged in recess session, which was actually in pro forma session, those 3 are invalid. And that means all of their decisions are invalid.
And looking at the history, it's interesting because in the 18th century, when the Senate went on break, they left for 9 months.
Right.
So it would make sense that, you know, if the Senate's out of town for 9 months, I guess if they're going in a buggy or something, it takes a while to get back to Florida,
Virginia,
right? Yeah,
Florida,
wherever you've got to go. So, you know, it's not like today you jump on a plane. So it made sense you'd have recess appointments when the Senate wasn't in session if they take 9 months off. But I think in this time, you know, the Senate's pretty available. Someone can jump on a plane and be there Monday usually.
Well, see, this is the problem, because the concept of recess has completely changed. Now the recess that you normally have is maybe over the Christmas time or possibly Easter. And the Senate takes normal vacations, but they normally, most of the time, everybody's there, or at least a percentage are there. And because of these pro formas, they're specifically left there, so there could be no recess appointment.
And there's also some other interpretive issues, not only with the recess appointment, is like whether the person who was previously there left during a recess. And then, you know, there's also a question is like, well, wait a minute, no, you're only supposed to appoint people who leave during a recess. Like if you had a 9-month recess, it would make sense. Someone retires or dies or gets killed, and you have to appoint someone in a 9-month period. And, you know, in a short period, that doesn't happen very often now. I mean, you don't actually have someone resign.
Well, you don't run those circumstances. Those circumstances don't even come up.
So there's also that too. Is like whether you can do a recess appointment at all if it was vacant for 6 months while the Senate was in session, and you wait for the 2 days that they're not around. Is that valid?
There's actually more to this, because the president actually didn't even put anyone up for nomination. So it wasn't like he was trying to get people nominated that were being rejected. It was like he didn't even appoint anyone for a nomination or recommend anyone to fill those positions. So when he actually made those recess appointments, those people had never even been put up to be determined whether or not they're qualified to do the job. And I would say that people that were union organizers are not really supposed to be in charge of whether or not a private company can use a union or not use a union.
Well, you would think that the NLRB probably would have a split board. You know, they'd have some business, some labor. You know, you'd have something like that. I mean, that would be, that would be maybe a little more fair. Okay, so, but this kind of goes to the constitutional question of you know, Alexander Hamilton, you know, in the Federalist 70, he said that, you know, you look at Article 1, Section 8, and the president of the executive is supposed to have a lot of power to protect us from foreign attacks.
Right.
And but it's not, you know, but to be an instigator of domestic revolution rather than protection of national security and enforcer of the laws. So when the executive uses that power in a domestic situation, that large executive power, that's not as a lot of the framers had intended the executive to use. In fact, they intended Congress to have, you know, the power in domestic issues.
Well, I know, Mark, and what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to wait and see how that's appealed by the administration. But what's our third topic for the night?
Okay, so this is a topic because of all the shootings and massacres and
gun control
tragedies going on all around, and it's a pretty, you know, it even came up in the you know, State of the Union, gun enforcement. So there was 90 sheriffs said that they're not going to help enforce gun laws.
Why did they say that? They're supposed to enforce the law.
Well, there's actually one sheriff who said, look, we can't even get there for 40 minutes. You know, you need to have a gun if you're going to protect yourself. I mean, we can come there and take a report, but it's all over by the time we get there.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that it's better to have citizens have guns to protect themselves because the police can't get to the scene of the crime fast enough to protect the citizen?
Yeah, there was a sheriff who actually came out and made that claim. But there was 90 sheriffs that said, we're not going to take guns away from law-abiding citizens. We don't mind if law-abiding citizens have guns, and we're not going to take them away. the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Okay, they depend on local enforcement to
bolster their control,
to refer things, and
of
so
course.
and these states say, well, we're not going to refer them. Now, is that a lot of people? 90 sheriffs out of all the sheriffs? Probably not, but they still say that they don't. Mostly rural sheriffs. But the issue is, there's a huge divide in the country. Some people think that nobody should have guns except the government, large amount of people, and a lot of people thinking like, everyone should be able to have a gun as long as they're not a felon. As long as they're a law-abiding citizen, they ought to be able to have a gun if they want one.
Well, wait a minute. I want to throw something in here, Mark. The Second Amendment says we can have guns. Now, it doesn't say necessarily we're going to have Uzis and MAC-10s and silenced machine guns. That's not what it says. But the idea that we're going to be restricting guns, the Supreme Court's actually ruled on this now twice, and they're about to rule on it again in New York and Chicago, saying that citizens have a right to bear an arm. And New York and Chicago, of course, tried to take all guns away from legal people that bought them legally, right? Well, so the Supreme Court's already started to rule on this. So now how is this going to fly in the face of the Supreme Court rulings that we've had over the last 2 years?
Well, Heller versus District of Columbia, okay, and that was the Second Amendment. They said, right to bear arms, will not be infringed. And so it's not saying that even on the Constitution you're granted that right. I mean, that's considered a God-given right. You have a right to.
Isn't it to protect us against the tyranny of the government?
Well, that's, the framers felt that a well-armed citizenry was a free citizenry. That's what they felt. And so they said the Second Amendment, you can't take away someone's arms. Now, when you start talking about, okay, it's like, for instance, Senator Feinstein wants
that would be Dianne Feinstein from California.
Wants to ban 158 types of weapons, clips that hold more than 10 rounds. The counter-argument to that would be, okay, if you're going to make a constitutional law, if you're going to go and talk about something.
Abridge the Constitution.
Okay, well, it's got to be a legitimate government interest, right?
Right.
It's got to be narrowly tailored.
Narrowly tailored, yes.
Okay, so the question is, so if you're using, your rifle for protection, and a criminal got 20 rounds, and you've got 3 rounds, not really much of a fair fight. So you would say, I mean, to a certain point, what the argument you were saying, well, can you have a Uzi, can you have this? I think, people would say, well, the citizen ought to be able to have the standard issue of whatever's out there. If they're going to protect themselves, it's not fair that they have like a, they have to load it with a, thing in there.
Musket loader.
Musket
pour
loader.
it. Let's pour in the powder, the black powder in the ball and the
boy, the other guy's got a.
Well, I know Dianne Feinstein would probably prefer that because then we only get one shot. There's the bigger issue here. We have a mental health problem in this country, and that problem goes back to the time when they stopped funding hospitals that dealt with mental health issues. Now they feel it's more important just to prescribe Ritalin and all the various drugs to control our youth. Well, unfortunately, our youth is not being controlled by these drugs. They're being warped by these drugs. So when it's about a gun control, wait a minute. It's not the gun that's shooting. It's somebody with the gun in their hand that's shooting. So, we look at the one, was it the Sunnybrook, the latest one in Connecticut. That child was abnormal for the last 10 years of his life prior to that shooting. His mother, who kept arms in the house to try to entertain him at some level, made a mistake. He was not diagnosed. He should have probably been incarcerated in a mental facility because his lack of reality. And if you look at these shootings, Columbine, these kids were on Ritalin, Prozac. They were out because of mental health problems, overtreated by prescription narcotics, trying to control their problems. So when we look across this, it's not the gun that's doing the shooting. It's the person with a bad attitude and the inability to know right from wrong that's pulling the trigger.
Well, okay.
And how does Dianne Feinstein address that? Is there a health issue in there?
I would say the counter argument to that would be, okay, but if the guy's only got, a muzzle loader, he can only shoot one person. If he's got a 30 clip, he can shoot 30 clip if he's crazy. So that'd be the counter argument to that. So there is counter arguments. The issue is like, okay, tragedies, there are these things that happen, and we have the ex-Navy police officer in L.A.
Yeah, Connor or whatever.
Yeah, he seemed unbalanced, and
he was unbalanced. I mean, look at his whole modus operandi in this case. He blamed everybody else except himself. of course, and he's a big, burly guy, well, great shape and all that, but mentally imbalanced. And it wasn't the guns he used that killed people. It was him that pulled the trigger.
Right. But I'm just saying, if you look at these, the larger fatality rates are actually from handguns, like say in Chicago, on just regular crime. Even though these things are pretty spectacular, and it's terrible because they're tragic.
Well, you know, Chicago has the highest murder rate,
right.
and they have the strictest gun laws.
Right.
Chicago has the highest murder rates in the country, but also has the strictest gun laws, which means private citizens cannot protect themselves against the people, the thugs that are running wild in the streets of Chicago. That is a mistake. In Texas, where people can carry guns concealed, crime rate is one of the lowest in the countries. And another thing, when you have laws that say you can protect yourself, protect your family, protect your homestead, those states have lower burglary rates because people know that there's guns there protecting the households. So we have to look more across the board. We cannot just pretend that, oh, it's a clip that has 30 rounds in it that makes the difference. No, we have to make a determination. Do we want our law-abiding citizens to be sheeple, to be slaughtered by thugs, or do we want our law-abiding citizens to be able to have the right to carry arms? Now, many states under this current push are saying now everyone can carry firearms concealed. Texas has always allowed that for I don't know how long, but and there's several other states that allow that. Like I said, if a criminal knows you're armed or the potential that you're armed, their chance of coming after you is going to be dramatically reduced. Now, the mental health issue is what should be addressed. Not, oh, we're going to ban a bunch of guns. It should be, how are we going to address the mental health issue of the people in this country? How are we answering that, Mark? Is there any answer to that?
Well, I would say that, you know, you're probably going to have more mental health issues as this, you know, things get more crowded, as the economy is not recovering in year after year or decade. You know, we've had, what, 4 or 5 years of the economy not really stalled, 1.5%, 2% growth. You know, people get out of college, they don't have a job. You know, business, the government's growing in leaps and bounds. Right. So there's a lot of more government taxation
But doesn't that bring stress to the people?
And then there's, you know, and then people are getting, some assistance as far as food and one thing or another, some scraps off the table. But I would say that, yeah, as you have you're in a low economic state, a lot of people very desperate, you know, that could add to this. But I also think, you know, you just have a lot more stressful situations, and you have a lot more people, so you're just going to see more of these mental health breakdowns.
I think you're correct, Mark, because I think the whole concept about mental health, stress, the economy, all adds to a couple things. One, people are more desperate in their lives. Two, nobody just gets a free check. And although they may get a free check for whatever reason, or a free cell phone from this government or whatever, the problem is this. We can't solve it tonight, but I'd like to see where these laws go, whether they get passed or not. And just on that note, I'd like to thank Mark for tonight, and we wish you a good evening from Law Talk. Thank you.